Hi friends, so today we're going through the Closed Sicilian and specifically these slow push type of positions and how you can play these middle games. I've chosen some of Spassky's best games in the Closed Sicilian to highlight some of the main ideas for you. So I hope you enjoyed this video and I'll see you in a few seconds. So the first example I've chosen is more to highlight the key ideas on how to play this type of slow push structure. So after e4, c5, knight c3, this is a very common start to the Closed Sicilian. There are other ways you can play it as well. For example, d3 is a very good response, which I've tried in the past. After the move knight c6, we get into a very similar structure to a Closed Sicilian with the advantage that white hasn't put the knight on c3. So after f4, d6, something similar to the actual game here, we find that this extra option of playing c3 can be very useful for white, because white can go for this plan of putting the pawn on d4 and eventually maybe e5 to cut off the scope of this g7 bishop. But in the game, white went for knight c3, d6, g3, knight c6, bishop g2, g6, d3. It's very common for white to fianchetto the bishop in the Closed Sicilian structure, and here white has a number of different setups he can opt for. For example, one option is to go bishop to e3 followed by queen d2 and looking to go for a quick kingside attack with bishop h6 and maybe even push the h pawn up if black castles a bit too early. This can be effective if played in the right situation, but often black has sufficient counterplay in the center as well as on the queen side. In this position, Spassky opted for f4, which is a very good response if white wants to put the knight onto f3 anyway, because at some point we want to slowly push our kingside pawns, so we may as well just put it on f4 right away. Knight f6, knight f3 castles, rook to b8. Black often wants to play on the queen side or in the center in response to a kingside attack. h3, b5 was played, and here white played the move pawn to a3. Now, we know that black's plan is to play pawn to b4, so we may as well include this a3 move in, because at some point when the exchange of the pawns happen, at least we'll get the open a file for our rook. a5, bishop to e3 was played, b4, captures, knight to e2, bishop to b7, and now we play the move pawn to b3. So another option apart from b3 is to go for the c3 pawn advance. I think the reason why Spassky didn't play c3 here is because of captures, and a move such as c4, which would break up the pawn chains in the center. So white wants to play d4 here, but black will just capture the pawn here. And white doesn't want to ruin his pawn structure because that would give black counterplay, and at the same time we wouldn't be able to focus on our kingside pawn advance. So therefore Spassky opted for b3, just closing everything on the queen side. That's how you want to play this type of position, closing the counterplay on the queen side and in the center. After rook a8, rook c1, rook a2, Spassky continues with g4, queen a8, queen e1. This is a very useful maneuver to remember in all sorts of anti-Sicilian positions where the queen just hops to the h4 square followed by a f5 pawn advance. So queen f2 is played in this game. Knight goes to a7, looking to take advantage of the dark squares. f5 to open up the f file. We capture, and knight to g5. So this knight g5 and queen h4 maneuver is very strong and can be used in all types of positions. Here it involves the rook sacrificing for the knight on f6 to set up some checkmating threats on h7 later. So this can be very strong. After knight a3, queen h4, threatening the sacrifice. Black played rook to c8, but Spassky went for the sacrifice anyway, with rook takes f6, pawn takes on f6, and queen h7 check. So notice that Spassky is not worrying about this pawn on c2, which is come under attack. He can't really defend it anyway, but he's focusing all his energy on the attack on the king side and making sure that breaks through. king f8 was played, and here white has a very strong move to continue the attack, and that is the sacrifice knight takes f7. Okay, so we don't want to retreat the knight at this point in time because we've already made some committal moves and sacrifices with the rook, so we want to keep going and adding more fuel into the fire. So after rook takes c2, bishop h6 check, bishop h6, rook c1, knight takes, king takes f7, and now we have the move queen takes g7, king e8, and Spassky continues his attack with the move pawn to g5. So threatening to take here with the pawn and perhaps promote into a queen later. So f5 is played, queen takes g6 check, king d7, and here queen f7 check was played, king c6, and pawn takes f5, forced resignation because white's pawns here are just way too strong to stop. So this next game features a very important pawn sacrifice idea which you need to keep in mind when playing these type of positions. We can see that white's developed these pieces in a very similar manner to the previous game, except for the fact that knight is on h3, which is actually a very trendy try currently. The idea is that if black takes on f4, we can capture back with the knight and really go for this weak square on d5. Here in this position, white played the move pawn to f5. So a sacrifice you need to remember in order to stop black from playing f5, also in order to fight for the light squares and create some holes on the king side which we can take advantage of. So after the move pawn takes f5, white played queen to h5, really preparing the move knight to g5 next and really eyeing this pawn on f7. h6 was played to stop this, and after rook f2, white defends the pawn on c2, bishop e6, bishop to e3, queen d7, and here notice that white is not taking the pawn on f5 too early. We're not really concerned about this. Actually, we want black to take here on e4, which would open up our f-file for our rooks and pieces to get into the attack. We're happy to sacrifice this pawn. So after rook f1, castles queenside. Here Spassky played the move knight to d5, but he missed a good opportunity to go bishop takes d4, pawn takes, and pawn takes on f5. So the whole point of this sacrifice is to fight for these light squared weaknesses. That's what white's doing with this variation. So we take the knight here on d4, put all the pawns on black squares, and we capture here. If black captures here, then we can capture on e6. We can see that the rook is coming to f7, the bishop is opened up in this long diagonal, so white has a tremendous position here. If after knight f5, white can play the move knight to d5, the bishop can't capture because, well, we can always recapture back with the threat of rook takes f7 when the knight moves. So instead white plays the move knight to e3, and then after rook takes f7, white has a tremendous position here because we're skewering the queen and bishop along the 7th rank. Instead, after knight to d5, the game continued. Pawn takes on e4, capture the knight, queen takes, we traded off, and rook takes f7. Spassky went on to win a nice game, which ended in a knight versus bishop endgame. I won't go through the whole game in this video, but you can check out the whole game in the description below. I will link to you if you're interested, and I will see you on the next one. So this next game features this knight h3 idea again, which has become really popular nowadays after the move pawn to f4. The idea is that when black captures on f4, we capture back with the knight, and the knight is going to target this really weak square on d5. So after the move knight to e5 from black, h3 was played. Useful idea to just stop knight g4, and also white wants to expand later with g4. Bishop e6, queen to d2, queen d7, and here white played the move pawn to a3, rook to e8, and king to h2. Pawn to b6, and white played the move pawn to g4. So the idea of g4 is just to gain some space and really keep an eye out for black playing this move pawn to f5, which is going to be the main pawn break in this situation. queen to d8. Here white went back with the king to h1, bishop c8, queen e1, we saw this maneuver before, bishop to b7, queen went to g3 this time, queen d7, rook a e1, b5, bishop to g1. So Spassky is just taking his time here, building, improving the pieces to better squares before he comes up with exactly what pawn break to go for. So a5 was played. We have the move knight to e1. An idea which you should keep in mind in closed Sicilian positions, the knight can often reroute to a better square, such as e3, f2, and sometimes even go to the g4 square. Knight c6, we have bishop to e3, knight to d4, queen f2, b4, captures, captures, and because we moved our knight away from the c3 square, we free up the pawn advance, pawn to c3. Captures, captures, and then here Spassky played the move knight to d5. So we see this open f file coming into play. Bishop takes d5, pawn takes d5, knight c7, c4. Gave Spassky a big advantage because he has the bishop pair, some open lines of attack here on the king side, and the open f file. So you can again catch the rest of the game in the description below. I just wanted to show you the idea with the knight going to h3 and how useful this setup can be. So here's another common idea in many of these closed Sicilian positions. So if you want to try and work out what Spassky played here, then do pause the video. Otherwise, I'll go through the solution with you now. So in this position, Spassky played the move pawn to e5, a pawn sacrifice which you should keep in mind. The idea is that if black doesn't do anything, then we have opened up this bishop on the g2 diagonal, and we've also threatened to take here on d6 and freed up a square on e4 for our knight, and then kick the knight on d4 away with the move pawn to c3. So it's a very useful move in general. So black should accept this sacrifice with pawn takes, and bishop takes e5. But because of the pressure that white has along these diagonals with the bishop, white will in fact just win the pawn back anyway after the move knight to e4 here. We're threatening to play c3 and put pressure on c5, and there's no way black can sufficiently defend this without playing b6, which would seriously weaken this diagonal for some discovered attack tactics. After f5, knight takes c5 was played, queen d6, and Spassky just continued with the move pawn to b4 to defend his knight. Rook to b8, pawn to c3, knight b5. Black is attacking this pawn twice, but white can play this in-between move, pawn to d4. And here if knight takes here on c3, then we have the in-between move, pawn takes bishop, which would simultaneously attack the queen here on d6, which doesn't give time for black to capture our knight on d1. So after bishop f6, queen b3 was played, the game continued b6, knight goes back to d3, bishop b7, captures, captures, a4, knight c7, and rook fe1. And we can see that after everything, we see white has a very nice position because of this very strong pawn majority on the queen side. Black also has this weakness on e6, which can be easily attacked by just doubling rooks. And also we have this bind in the center with this pawn on d4, creating this square on e5, which we can utilize later on as well. So thanks to this e5 pawn advance, Spassky has managed to increase advantage in the middle game. And again, you can check out the rest of the game in the description below. So this last game here I chose was played by Brujon with the white pieces. This didn't actually come from a closed Sicilian, but you can see the structure is very, very similar. And it goes to show that you can play this idea in many, many different positions, not just from a Sicilian. You can play it from the black side sometimes. And this one came from a Philidor defense from the white side. In this position, white played an idea which you should definitely keep in mind, and that is to utilize all your pieces when you're trying to get your attack going. So if you look at this position, how many pawn breaks does black actually have? His main pawn breaks are going to be pawn to b5 and pawn to d5 or pawn to f5. Now pawn to f5 is very risky in this situation, so he's probably not going to do that one, which leaves d5 and b5. Well, we've completely stopped b5, and at the moment we have full control over d5, so we have a lot of space here and we have a lot of time, and what you should do is improve your pieces first. One of the squares for your knights, which is often quite bad, is the b3 and b6 squares, so we don't really want our knights on these particular squares. So here Brujon takes his time and plays the move knight to c1, a very strong knight maneuver to bring the remaining forces into the attack. After knight c5 he played knight to e2, knight a6 was played, and then knight to g3. So I see that white has spent 3 moves playing this maneuver, but it doesn't really matter because black hasn't been able to even prepare these pawn breaks yet. Knight c5 was played, again bishop to d4, just preparing pieces, putting them onto better squares. Rook to b8, rook to d2, bishop back. So now black is preparing the move pawn to b5 to try and get some counterplay on the queen side. Brujon plays the move rook to d1, b5 was played, we have captures, and now there's a weak square on d5 which is opened up. But it's very important that white doesn't play the move knight to d5 here, which may be tempting to play, because even though we win the light squared bishop, we make our last 2 moves sort of redundant, because there's no point doubling rooks on an open file only to close the file up later on. That doesn't make any sense. Therefore, white goes for the move pawn to e5 instead. So he's trading off this weak pawn on d6, but this opens up his pieces a lot more, and now he's preparing to play the move knight to d5, but won't end up with a pawn on d5. So we have a captures on g2. Knight went to b4 to stop knight d5 to f6, which would fork the king and rook. Knight to e4 was played, takes, and now white is threatening to play the move knight to f6. The game continued knight to d5 to stop that, but now white can win some material by force with the move pawn takes d6, bishop takes d6, knight takes d6, queen takes d6, and a nice way to finish off the game. When your opponent is stuck in a pin like this, then we can just apply maximum pressure to the pinned piece, which is the knight on d5. So instead of playing bishop e5, which would allow black to say check on these diagonals and escape, instead white just calmly drops the bishop back to f2, and we see this pin is going to win a piece for white. The only way to get out of it is to play the move knight takes f4, but then after rook takes queen, knight takes, we take back, and white is a whole piece up. So that concludes my examples for this video. That's all I have. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I will catch you on the next one.